Hello and welcome. This is Brian Gazzetta, and this will be my dissertation case study analysis. The dissertation that I chose was by Dr. Lena Marie Rombalski, and her title of her dissertation was Perceived Government Legitimacy, the Effect of Bureaucratic Representation. And she presented this in 2010 to the Department of Political Science at Northern Illinois University. And she started her dissertation with a quote from Woodrow Wilson from 1887. And it states, "It is getting to be harder to run a constitution than it is to frame one." And I think this is fitting as we study bureaucratic legitimacy. We wonder if the founding fathers had any idea of the complexity of the government that they were creating was eventually going to become. So we start off with her topic. Her topic that she was going to focus on is the analysis undertaken focuses on the effect of racial and ethnicity of local government employees on perceived legitimacy of government. And the background is she did quite a bit of research on the increasing minority population. And especially on that our census is predicting that our minorities are just going to increase. And her study revolves around the perception of minorities and the perception of the minorities that are working in the government workforce as compared to the legitimacy of that government, or if a highly represented minority workforce has an increased perception of government legitimacy. And you can see this is quite fitting. This dissertation was presented in 2010, so it was wrote in the 2007, 2008, 2009 era. And we realized that during that period of time, our nation was electing its first minority president. And a lot of topics were very pressing at that time. The amount of minority representation, minorities in office, the impact of minorities in office. So you can understand why this was very fitting in 2008 and how it's actually still very fitting in today's world. Her problem statement was whether the race and ethnicity of municipal employees influence the way citizens perceive local government as a legitimate entity. And right off the bat, she had some issues. And one of the issues she had was based upon the actual definition of government legitimacy. Because she realized in the scholarly community there wasn't a pure and concise definition of government legitimacy. So right off the bat, she decided that she was going to let everybody know that there was some limitations and that she was going to utilize Dr. Tyler's definition of government legitimacy. So from his work, Conceptualization Frameworks of Legitimacy to Measure Perceived Government Legitimacy, she chose to use Dr. Tyler's definition of government legitimacy, which is a government's ability to respond to citizens' needs and preferences. So throughout the rest of her study, that was going to be her definition of government legitimacy. So she utilized an in-depth lit review. She realized that in order for anybody to understand her work, an individual would need to have a understanding of the theories that her work was built upon. So she spent a great deal of time discussing in depth the different theories. First of all, she talked about representative bureaucracy theory. Second, she introduced the implications of an increased bureaucratic representation within an organization. Third, she defines perceived government legitimacy, and this was important because this correlated with the model for the conceptualization of the dependent variable that she was going to utilize within her study. And finally, she talked about legitimacy theory and how that contributed to representative bureaucracy. So when it came to her data for the study, she used a mixed data method, and it was mixed because she used both quantitative and qualitative research. Her quantitative data was based upon demographics that she collected from the 2000 census, and this information was about where government employees worked. The second was qualitative and was based upon surveys, and she gathered these surveys, secondary data sets, or secondary data from the National Citizen Survey, the NCS, and then from that survey she made a secondary survey in which she used a template from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And this sample was based upon the map you see there on the right, and those states that are shaded in green. Within those states, there was 19 different communities that she took data from the 2008 NCS database. And from these 19 communities, there were some 9,219 different citizen responses. And it was very important to her that her time frame be very limited. So her surveys were submitted during only the month of April of 2008. And this was important to her because she didn't want the citizens' external perceptions of government to be influenced during a large period of time. We realized that during 2008, economic crisis was occurring, a lot of other external factors that might influence people's perception, and so she wanted to limit it to 1 month so that they weren't influenced by a large amount of information. And right off the bat, she indicated that it was a limitation to this sample, and mostly the limitation was the fact that she was concerned that the 19 communities in those various green states was too small for generalization purposes. So she identified that as a possible limitation. This was a PhD dissertation, so she utilized hypotheses, and she had 3 questions that she attempted to answer. The first question was, what local governments used in this study, do local governments used in this study have proportionate levels of racial and ethnic minority representation? The second question was if citizens' perceptions about government legitimacy are higher in smaller communities than they are in larger communities. And she defined higher as more positive, and she defined larger communities as communities with populations that exceed 50,000. And her final question was if local governments with higher levels of racial and ethnic representation have higher levels of perceived government legitimacy. And from those questions, she got the following results. Her first result was that most local governments in the sample, or 63%, do have proportionate levels of racial and ethnic representation based upon their community demographic profile. Her second question, the result was that citizens' perceptions rating about government legitimacy are higher in smaller to medium-sized communities than they are in larger ones. Her third result was that local governments with higher levels of bureaucratic representation show higher citizens' ratings about perceived government legitimacy. And from her study, she was also able to make a supplemental analysis. From the surveys, they rated different forms of data, and she was able to pull out from that data that the 2 most important qualities was the quality of the experience and the bureaucratic representation. From the study, she decided that there could be further studies. One was that she would like to see the sample size increased from those 19 communities, and if we increase that sample size, it might give you a better understanding of the representation of all the U.S. and not just those 19 communities. The second, she thought it would be interesting to reverse the study. The study was based upon a citizen-employee relationship, and she thought a study on the employee-citizen relationship would also have merit. And finally, she thought a regression analysis would be appropriate, and that is a scientific approach to examine the direct and indirect effects of each of her independent variables. As we look at some of at how her research has contributed to our understanding of bureaucracy, I focus on the theorists that she used in her studies. We start with Frederick Mosher. We remember that Frederick Mosher was very close friend with Waldo and helped define this new generation of public administration. And his representative bureaucracy theory, Mosher not only argues that the role of the public servant is central to all decisions that the United States government makes, but that the public servant's background is equally important into guiding those decisions. We remember Kingsley and Krisloff's representative bureaucracy. They suggest that a demographically diverse public sector workforce will lead to policy outcomes that reflect the interest of all groups represented, including historically disadvantaged communities. And then I take a writing or a quote from Morgan from our literature, and I'm quoting Morgan when he says that shared values and shared beliefs, shared meaning, shared understanding, and a shared sense of making all equate to organizational reality. So we understand that when we have a representative bureaucracy, when we have a diverse representative bureaucracy, there is shared beliefs, there's shared values, and all of that equate to a legitimate bureaucracy. So I hope that you enjoyed this dissertation as much as I do. I look forward to your questions and comments and being able to discuss this further. So thanks for now, and I look forward to our conversations in the future.